Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to be talking about David Mitchell's Number 9Dream, his second book overall, and my third last book of my overall reading experience of his entire bibliography. If you don't know, all of his stories to some degree are interconnected. There is a meta component that is introduced in latter books of his that can possibly, I haven't read them all yet, of course, but it can have an overlay over everything else that is happening. The characters also overlap from their children, their children's children, to them as children, to them as adults, to the kids that they're having in the future. So it's very vastly spanning in time, and it's very interesting in a sort of scavenger hunt sort of way to put all of these pieces together as you're reading them. I'm finding it very interesting. This book, however, has a protagonist that I haven't heard of, at least yet. Again, I still have Utopia Avenue and Ghost written to consume, so he might be appearing in other ones, or he may even appear in books that I've read and I just didn't pick up on it because there's a very large stable of people. But this is about a 19-year-old kid, Edgy Mayaki, who lives in a rural area. Things at home we can ascertain are not very good. He leaves, goes to Tokyo, and explores like a sort of coming of age story in which he is searching for his father. And he is a sort of catcher in the rye, not so much the angst of Holden, but the wondering of what is aspects of his identity that he's unaware of, or exercising agency within him that he wants to know, explore, and hopes to sort of contextualize his larger identity within these things. He seems very lost. He's very naive. Sees himself as a foreigner within Tokyo City, and he is just trying to find something, I think, that grounds him. Edgy, we get the impression, is spinning like a top. There's only a certain amount of time until he's going down and hitting that table or surface, whatever he's spinning on. And we can tell this because this coming of age story is largely recontextualized by what his inner life is like, and it's very imaginative. It keeps switching between, well, initially there's very distinct sequences where the paragraph break will change and we can see that he's playing a video game or having an actual dream, and wild things are happening. It's like a cyberpunk future. Suddenly he's like a secret agent, suddenly he's battling drones, or he's hacking, or doing all these things that we could guess that these are not actually happening. But as the book progresses and actual strange things are occurring, they get sort of spun out into dreamlike sequences, and the lines between reality and fiction become blurred, as well as all David Mitchell books generally do. The genre starts bending. Things start getting to be a little bit more sci-fi, a little bit more like Inception-y. If you have seen Inception, it might help you understand some of the things that are happening in his mind, because though they make a certain amount of sense, there are restrictions on them, and some of them are actually a little bit frustrating because we are not sure how much of a digression they are on the actual plot that is happening. They still serve a purpose largely in characterizing Edgy himself. We learn more about him with every sequence, and as it goes on, I think though these worlds blend together, the plot asserts itself onto the fantastical elements much more. It's a very strange book. It's very interesting, I thought, and especially because the previous book that I read is just pretty much straight literary fiction with black swan green. By merging so completely the fantastical elements with reality, I think he's sort of asserting that it doesn't really matter what your perspective on life is. Everything becomes a very specific kind of journey that is subjective and unique to you, even if you try to explain it to somebody else, as the book is ostensibly trying to do. For one, it won't make some sense to some people. Some of it will resonate, some of it won't. But it's all a very fantastical journey, no matter how you interpret it. So you might as well have fun doing it and play some jazz, basically, is in terms of genre fiction. It's also very interesting to me because it's the first time that the voice didn't speak to me. Every other David Mitchell book that I've read, even Cloud Atlas, which has very different degrees of voice because of the genre changing with each novella-like story, it's still really compelling and interesting. And with this, I was a little bit removed, maybe because of the dream-like and fantasy-like sequences, but I felt like I was definitely more aware that I was reading a book and not immersed in it. And there's definitely some beautiful passages, and I can kind of admire it from a distance as to what it is doing and what it is saying about coming of age and how it's characterizing Edgy. But it's definitely the first voice where I found it kind of grating and annoying, and it might just be the fact that now at this age I just really don't like the way 19-year-olds think. I think the voice fits the character very well, but I found his naivety and his overall agency in the way that he asserts himself to be quite frustrating, and that might just be a projection of myself, essentially. I really don't like that. For instance, if I was rating it purely on an enjoyment scale, I would probably give it a 2 out of 5, yet I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 because all of the meta components and what he does with it is still something that I can appreciate, and when I'm consuming it, I really liked it. It was a lot more of a slog to consume just because the voice wasn't as interesting, but it gets a lot of, I derived a lot of satisfaction from consuming it, even still, just from reading it critically and seeing how it was doing what it was doing, basically, which I found to be quite unique. There's a lot of comparisons to Murakami's work, which I can see. I've read Norwegian Wood, and I appreciated that this wasn't as horny as Norwegian Wood is. Norwegian Wood is like all the other Murakami books that I've read. I really dislike the kind of harem component of it. He over-sexualizes and hyper-sexualizes women, and he gets away with it because he has a first-person narration going on. But eventually, I just stopped reading his stuff because it's not what I wanted to read. It was annoying that he was hypersexualizing everybody, and of course the male character, just like in animes of that type, ends up having lots of love interests and sleeping with people, but still having like a tortured inner life type thing. And maybe that's actually why this voice and Edgy story is kind of annoying for me, but yet I can still appreciate the other aspects of it. There's also a type of scavenger hunt that happens in the book where the number 9 reoccurs like a billion times. It couldn't be fun to see all these different occurrences, and maybe those things point to when a dream is occurring and not, but it happens so often that I'm not too sure. It could be fairly well delineated with the instances where he's not dreaming, and in the beginning the paragraphs are switching quite not obliquely, transparently between dream and reality, and then as it goes on and we're not really sure, maybe the reoccurring 9 happens when it is dreaming to kind of telegraph it. But I actually think it doesn't really matter to me. I consider reality to be whatever we're interpreting at the time, and a dream, just as with fiction, can affect us just as much as what reality is, as long as it is real to us. So I don't really care to make that distinction. I think that will really depend on your personality and your life views. But for me, I fall somewhere, I think, in between of the interpretations of this book, where some people hated the fact that the dream sequences, some of them of which are so digressive, don't need to be there, are stealing a little bit of the literary command of the prose. But I find them to be really well written, and I think, as I said, the blending of reality and fantasy doesn't really matter to me, so it didn't bother me. Some people really hated it from what the reviews that I can tell, and I think that's maybe why it's A, hard to talk about, and B, quite so polarizing as all of his other books. The interesting thing about this is I went in not even reading the blurb, not looking at reviews, so I knew nothing going into this book whatsoever. I didn't know even the premise. And actually, that might have hindered me from enjoying it a little bit, just because I would have liked to have been prepared a little bit more for the specific voice that I was going to be encountering. This is also the first book that I didn't really tab, because it takes a pretty high cognitive load to read this. I have like a nagging suspicion in the back of my mind that I certainly missed a few things, just because trying to fit the visual motifs that were happening into a liminal space in which the plot is happening. And to its credit, I do think all of the sequences move the plot along, except for a few digressions, but it, even when it is very, very blended with the two versions of reality, his imagination and what is happening, it does a lot better with the dream work sequences than some other books. So I'm going to talk a little bit about spoilers now if you haven't read the book, and if you haven't read other David Mitchell books, particularly the Bone Clocks, then I would not continue watching. The conclusion of the plot, based on how the fiction is moving along, is very satisfying by the end, because we have a through line from when he is on the train going to Tokyo and sort of drops a few hints about home life not being good, and then it's sprinkled throughout the book. The ending is really good because we kind of finally see in which ways it intersects with Norwegian Wood, for one, in which he's dealing with a loss of a family member specifically, and he is kind of, that sort of recontextualizes his world, and it makes a lot more sense by the end as to why this liminal space is happening to him. And it is a nice little metaphor for him running away from his problems, running away from home, and thinking that another parent who he never even knew and doesn't ostensibly want anything to do with him throughout the story is going to be the answer that he's seeking. He's clearly just running away, which is why I drove a parallel between it and Catcher in the Rye. The parallel with the Bone Clocks is there's a few different sections in this book. I think it is, I can't remember the exact section, but there's a point of view called the Mongolian, I believe, that feels like it could be a horologist standpoint, in which they're able to astral project out of their bodies and go into other bodies and do certain specific fantastic like things with people and their bodies. They can be possessed, they can suasion them to do certain things, and there's other gifts that we get to know throughout the other novels as well that can be happening. And that chapter seems like it's specifically from that point of view. It's sort of like a out-of-body experience, and suspicious things are happening where it could be a dreamlike sequence again with fantasy elements, or it could just be a horologist doing these things, which we know is solidified in the meta contextualization of all of these books. So it's an interesting point of view to have in the book, specifically because this is his second novel, so it'd be like 2 or 3 before Cloud Atlas and 4 before the bone clocks ever really interjects that meta component. So it's fun to think about what the writing experience of this book would be like for him if he was sort of just planning this reveal of the meta component, or it organically developed from these first sequences of books, or like did this chapter make him specifically develop the horologists and the carnivores? Who knows, maybe that stuff is in ghost written for all I know. But that component was very interesting and worked in tandem with the satisfaction of Edgy having to stop his specific coming of age journey, which, by the way, talking about Orientalism, I think this book does a fairly good job of dealing with it. You can tell he has lived in Japan and he sort of understands a foreigner's perspective and is avoiding those holes that white authors so often go into with talking about Asian, specifically Japanese, usually tropes and exoticization and things like that. However, it almost seems like he's giving himself a little bit of a pass with these things, because Edgy feels like he's sort of inserting all of these imaginative visual motifs from a Western perspective as well. Like, it's almost anime-esque in the way that, like, Yakuza is reoccurring, and cyborgs and mechs and all this wild stuff is happening. And he also kind of describes Tokyo in a cyberpunkish kind of way. And there's not really a lot of space for marginalized peoples, which is usually a hallmark of a white person trying to write somebody who is rural and impoverished, but is like constructing a narrative in which that is not a very big obstacle that is present in them. For instance, Edgy suddenly loses his virginity when he goes to a love hotel, which are predominant throughout Asia, at least in Korea where I've been. And he doesn't have any money, but he coincidentally meets the son of somebody we can surmise is mixed up in the Yakuza, and later it's gone into very much more. But the thing that happens is that he ends up not having to pay for anything, right? Because the authors don't want to have to deal with those things. And so it becomes almost like contrived in the way that they hand wave that stuff. In the end, he is dealt with the bill anyway, and he has to run away from it and whatnot, but that in itself is a trope of that kind of coming of age story with friends like that, where you don't know them, and probably you could tell as soon as the person says, don't worry about money, and he brings home these girls and they swap them and stuff, which was not that fun to read about. You can tell that he's going to get footed like that anyway. So there's it's a push-pull relationship for me, where a lot of the times it felt like he was doing a good job with the setting, yet I kept questioning in my head if a person who is rural and outside of Tokyo would present themselves so much like a foreigner from an Anglo-white foreigner would present themselves in such a similar parallel way. And I can't answer that question. I'm sure there's lots of other people who have done reviews that analyze that component. I've seen a couple that said it was quite good, but usually those were from white people having lived in Japan saying it's pretty true to it, and I'd rather see a person of color, preferably someone in Tokyo and Japanese, reviewing it and saying if it's exoticized or not. There's also a book, Le Grand Marisol, I believe, heavily, or at least somewhat, influences the character when he picks it up and reads it, and this makes an appearance in the Number9Dream as well, but it is similarly a peripheral thing. It's sort of like in the Matrix when there's a book on the shelves that references philosophy like Descartes or something like that. It's not something that the character literally consumes didactically in the narrative. It's just something that we could find at a meta level and parallel out. And I think that book, I hope I cited it correctly. Anyway, I know that it's a coming of age story, and so we can, I think it just points us to the fact that David Mitchell considers this a coming of age story, just like he considers it an homage to Norwegian Wood, though it is quite distinctly its own thing as well. So that'll do it for me. I'll see you next video, in which I am reading Ghost Written.